Anyway, I'm Julie Paulson, and I am going to read you some of my work from the book project I've been working on during my sabbatical. It's called Intelligence and Intelligibility. It is about intellectual disability and performance. It's about intelligence as a historically constructed category. And it's also about inclusive higher education. So it's about a lot of things. And I'm reading to you today from a chapter that's called Performing Down Syndrome, which I start off by talking about my son. So this is him. It was his debut performance at Cornell Elementary School talent show. And my son, Zachary, was the first act. He was a tiny, fragile-looking kindergartner, instantly readable as a child with an intellectual disability. He sat crouched in the middle of the stage in front of two floor drums where his father had just deposited him. Zachary paused, looked out at the crowd, and smiled. The audience waited. His parents watched nervously. Would he begin? Would he squat there, frozen, forever? How long would this go on? He had secured the audience's attention, and then he sat back and started to play with ease, pounding the drum in a single, regular rhythm. The crowd was rapt. He built momentum, added the beat of the second drum, and, as Art Blakely once said, washed away the dust of everyday life. Zachary closed, triumphant, throwing his fist into the air. The performance had lasted all of 40 seconds. The audience exploded into applause. I like to say, my son was born knowing how to work a crowd. Since he was a tiny child, Zachary has had a kind of intelligence that I have yet to master. Call it stage presence, an ability to read an audience. 5 years later, Zachary sat on another stage, this time with his entire 5th grade class, who had assembled for their promotion ceremony to middle school. It was a highly choreographed affair of entrances and exits and carefully memorized stories, poems, and songs, everywhere demonstrating how far they had come from those first days of kindergarten. When it came time to receive their certificates, each row of students, one by one, rose at the teacher's signal. As their names were called, the students filed by, shaking hands with the principal and teacher, walking in silence across the stage and back to their seats, where they stood, again waiting for this teacher's signal to sit down. Meanwhile, the parents were expected to be equally well-behaved. All clapping was to wait until the end, when all students had been called to receive their certificates. Zachary stared into space, mouth hanging open for most of the ceremony. He did not sing with the other children, although he sang the song just fine in the car on the way home. Placed in order of height for the requisite photographs, Zachary was the shortest and last student in the last row to be called. An aide stood at the ready to make sure everything would go according to plan. On cue, Zachary walked up, received his certificate, shook the extended hands, and then, beaming, threw his arm up into the air, grandly waving his certificate back and forth like a flag before the crowd as he marched across the stage and settled into his seat. The audience, obedient, waited for the principal to give us our signal. Then we clapped, cheered, and whooped for all our children. Zachary, another parent later remarked, always seems to express on the outside what we all feel on the inside. On display in these performances is a kind of social intelligence that allows Zachary to bond with others in his community, non-verbally and on his own terms. On one level, of course, he waved his certificate around simply because it was fun. Yet it was equally clear that he was in tune with both the celebratory nature and prescribed solemnity of the occasion. It was a characteristically mischievous performance. Parents, he seemed to say, I am going to make it difficult for you not to clap. He had the audience in the palm of his hand, egging on their repressed joy, even as he owned the singularity of his accomplishment. In short, he made the moment fully his own. As in the kindergarten talent show, one had the sense that Zachary was managing our expectations. The aid at the ready was not unnecessary, but the aid's presence stood in sharp relief, framing Zachary's display of bravado and competence. These performances enable Zachary to put on display the complexity of an inner life that, as a person whose verbal power of expression is limited, can otherwise be hard to access. In what follows, I argue that public performances, like the ones I've just described, serve as an important means through which people with intellectual disability are able to advocate for themselves on their own terms. Zachary's joy, his flouting of the rules, his connection to the moment, all attest to a life fully lived, a life of richness, not deprivation. Such performances are a tricky negotiation. The public acclamation my son receives is fragile, temporary, and intrinsically bound up to the stigma they attempt to address. Their success turns on the fact that he is young, cute, and therefore non-threatening, qualities that will be increasingly less available to him as he grows older. Bookending his elementary school career, they express his desire for recognition and connection. They are an assertion of his personhood, a bid for inclusion, and a pitch for full participation in the life of his community. The terms of that participation are part of the negotiation. He is not the child that will sing the song or recite the poem. His actions instead declare, this is what I offer. Much scholarship on disability focuses on cultural representations of intellectual disability. In this talk, I examine strategies people with intellectual disabilities use to represent themselves. Specifically, I explore public performance as a means through which people with Down syndrome, one of the most prevalent and readily recognizable forms of intellectual disability, have sought to present themselves to others, to confront social stigma, and to assert full membership in the human communities that marginalize and exclude them. I argue that public performance is one strategy through which people with Down syndrome have sought to claim their voice, to tell their own story, and thereby make themselves intelligible to others. Together, these performances present us with an alternative to more stigmatizing mentalist understandings of the foundations of personhood. They offer a more capacious and more accessible understanding of what it means to be an embodied consciousness intimately entwined with others. So in the longer version of this paper, I look at three main artist performers. The first is Eli Cooper, who I'm going to be talking about in just a moment, but I also look at a fiber artist, Judith Scott, and a British drag troupe called Drag Syndrome. This is the first section, or a bit of the first section of the paper, and it's called Suck My 2020, Eli Cooper's Art of Impersonation. I recognize something of Zachary's performative self-reinvention in the work of Bay Area artist Eli Cooper. Like Zachary, Cooper has Down syndrome, and as such, is a member of a social group that is often infantilized. Whereas Zachary is, in fact, a child, Cooper is a young man, an adult in his 20s. As his title suggests, Suck My 2020, Cooper's multimedia exhibition at the Creative Growth Arts Center in Oakland, California, is a response to the COVID-19 pandemic and a defiant send-off to a broken year of isolation. It is also an intimate act of self-revelation, presented through a series of artistic, ritual, and video performances. Like Zachary's, Cooper's performances express a desire for recognition, connection, and inclusion. As an act of self-expression, his assertion of voice and independent personhood takes the form of an acknowledgement of the communal sources of that voice and the mimetic nature of individual identity. Cooper's multimedia installation centered on a recreation of a part of his bedroom, documenting his individual experience of the pandemic. The exhibit provided viewers with a tangible picture of the daily routines that define Cooper's experience of a year in which across the globe, stay-at-home orders and social distancing guidelines curtailed life as we knew it, cutting us off from others and restricting us to our respective domestic spaces. A black leather sofa and coffee table sat in the middle of the gallery, displaying Cooper's just-in-case supplies, an extension cord, bottled water, packs of gum, a bong. Heaps of bags of mini marshmallows was piled haphazardly on a display block near the front door. Packs of soda were stockpiled at stations throughout the gallery. Reproducing those that cover his bedroom walls at home, a series of collages made up of images of rock stars, celebrities, politicians, and family members hung on the walls of the gallery. A practice that Cooper began in 2015, the collages serve as a visual diary. It is deeply personal, creating an intimate mode of self-expression through its juxtapositions. With a combination of affection, dark humor, and idolatry, the exhibit's press release notes, Cooper places a grandparent next to a porn star, which is surrounded by bags of marshmallows, Kiss, Bill Clinton, and a graphic scene from American Pie 8. Cooper initially called his collage, which now stretches from floor to ceiling in his bedroom at home, his wall of fame. He now refers to it as family. In bringing together the objects that defined his experience of the pandemic, Cooper's assemblage describes a process whereby, in the philosopher Bruce Wilshire's words, a conscious body is returned to itself as itself from its objects. In putting the personal stuff of his private life on public view, Cooper's reconstruction of interior domestic space serves as a figure of his inner life. It was also clearly the space of fantasy, a series of music videos conceived by and starring Cooper were projected 20 feet high against the back wall of the gallery. In the videos, Cooper, impersonating a series of rock stars, presides over the space. He is a deft performer, in turns adulatory, exuberant, and ironic. Lightning flashes against a dark backdrop, Cooper in full face paint as kisses Gene Simmons, lip syncs God of Thunder, blood spitting, pelvis thrusting, tug wagging, and all Simmons' hair metal glory. Cooper's take on AC/DC's Back in Black, in contrast, riffs on band leader Angus Young's stage persona. His impersonation of Sandler is more meditative. Cooper inhabits a still different kind of rebel rock and roll masculinity in his video of Queen's Somebody to Love. The video begins with a field of bright yellow daffodils. A large red rose appears in the foreground, blossoms, and then Cooper, now appearing in a white tank top as a tiny Freddie Mercury appears Thumbelina-like at the rose's center. The song swells, the rose disappears, and Cooper's figure swells too, now floating in the field of daffodils. The background changes and now is dominated by a static picture of a lineup of Speedo-clad men, the camera rolling up and down their muscled forms. Cooper's hand lightly, tentatively strokes his crotch. Clearly, Cooper is no precious angel with Down syndrome. The installation works in multiple ways to upend stereotypes about disability. Cooper's adoption of a rock star persona, love of heavy metals, grinding rhythms, and use of sexual innuendo take a pretty straight shot at common misperceptions of Down syndrome as a kind of eternal childhood, a perpetual state of cheery innocence. Cooper aims to offend at least a little. We see the same kind of aggressive masculine sexuality present in Kiss's video in the exhibition's title. In announcing that the year 2020 can suck my dick, Cooper declares his exhibition one big fuck off to the year defined by COVID-19. As a direct address and challenge to his viewers, his title is also a tongue-in-cheek demand that we suck his 2020, that our consumption of his exhibition take on the form of sexual submission. Yet the title is also suggestive of something more vulnerable. In a view of a year of rupture and isolation, Cooper's Suck My 2020 serves in an attempt to fill in the lack left by our individual and communal losses with a defiant send-off to the whole damn thing. Tempting as it is, however, to read Cooper's adoption of a rock star's renegade persona as a deliberate send-off to common misperceptions of Down syndrome, his videos notably make no explicit reference rather, to his disability. By contrast, the Argentinian advocacy group Downiet, which produces short videos for circulation on social media, expressly uses tropes of youthful rebellion as a means of changing popular misperceptions of Down syndrome. And this is the point in my talk where I am hoping that a picture is indeed going to be worth at least 1,000 words, because I'm going to skip over a section of my talk, but I talk for some length about one of their videos called Angelitas, in which a group of teens with Down syndrome, they dress up as angels and they embody these stereotypes, and they put out and they play music and they sway and tears flow in the audience, and they put out their little cans and collect donations, and then they rip off their angel outfits and go running all over the city, having fun, spending the money they've collected on just having a great time, getting piercings and tattoos. The couple in the bottom corner checks into a hotel. Anyway, so the message here is clear. We are not special, right? Precious angels. We are humans, the videos declare, who have the same realities, the same joys, desires, and sense of fun as anyone else. When we see images of disabled people doing ordinary things, it is often in the form of what has come to be known as inspiration porn. The term, coined by the late disability activist Stella Young, refers to heartwarming stories about people with disabilities that are designed to make non-disabled people feel good about themselves. They circulate widely. The video of the deaf person who receives a cochlear implant and hears for the first time. The poster showing a child with prosthetic legs running a race bearing the slogan, "The only disability is a bad attitude." The news clip about the high school student with Down syndrome who was allowed to score a touchdown in the football game, and so on. These inspirational stories are porn because they objectify disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purposes of such images, Young explains, is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be that person. They exist to make non-disabled people feel good about themselves. And that focus devalues the lived experience of disability by imagining it as something that needs to be fixed or overcome. In presenting disabled people as objects for others' gratification, they are deeply dehumanizing. Whereas inspiration porn circulates images of people with disabilities doing ordinary things in order to inspire non-disabled people, the tropes of youthful rebellion, in which Valentine, this is the star of the Downey It videos, and Cooper trade, the teen who cut school to enjoy an unencumbered day in a vibrant city. This is the video Libertad that they do, or the aggressive, brutal, dominating rhythms of heavy metal, as in the case of Cooper, resist such a reading. The rebel is a figure defined not by their inability to follow cultural norms, but by their defiance of them, where their nonconformity is a site of resistance rather than pity. Rather than putting such images forward in order to inspire others, they present people with disabilities behaving in ordinary ways in order to challenge normative expectations of what it means to have an intellectual disability and defy the notion that their life is a tragedy. By inviting viewers into their experiences of the world, they mark themselves as subject, not object.
Dr. Paulson?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I mean, this is really fantastic. Like, I think I speak for everyone. This is really, really great. But if we do want to have our discussion, I wonder if you could wrap it up, maybe a minute, 2 minutes?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Thank you.
In the rest, I just want to point to a couple of things. So what the kind of the core of what is interesting to me about here is this idea of adopting a role. What does it mean in performance to adopt a role? And in Cooper's case, his impersonation, by allowing him to channel his star power, allows him to embody this range of social identities. But it's a way of establishing a social identity that is not based on kind of inner mentalistic terms as we're used to thinking about personhood. And so this philosopher, Bruce Wilshire, has been very important. And I'm not going to read the whole quote to save time, but his idea is this thinking about discovering yourself in role playing, in playing a part, that we don't find our identity as this kind of inner spaceless self, but in performing a role. And so I'm just going to read the last couple of paragraphs. Significantly, Cooper does not ask us to identify with those he impersonates. In this, Cooper's performances are different from the theatrical ones. As Wilshire explains, the actor in the world stands in for a character in the world of a play, and thereby stands in for us, who are likewise in the world. In impersonating Simmons, Cooper does not stand in for him in this way. Cooper's performances are not meant to reveal something, whether real or imagined, about his idols. We are not asked to identify or empathize with them. Instead, what Cooper's art of impersonation so movingly reveals is not Gene Simmons, but Eli Cooper. Instead, as he assumes a role, we are asked to identify with Cooper himself. We start to see both Cooper and ourselves, in Wilshire's words, as bodies biologically human who learn to be human persons by learning to do what persons around them are already doing. We start to see how the learning body mimetically incorporates the model and comes to represent that model and be authorized by it. I'm just going to skip to the end. In contrast to the stigmatizing definitions of the human based on our capacity for rational thought, Cooper's performances encourage viewers to recognize that one sense of being a human self does not originate somewhere inside the recesses of our mind, but is instead the product of a minded body that is returned to itself as itself through its performances. For Cooper, playing a role is a deeply humanizing act, one defined by paraspacity, respect, and responsiveness on the part of the performer that ultimately draws us together. In doing so, Cooper's art of impersonation presents a framework for viewers to acknowledge the full humanity of people with intellectual disabilities. On the basis of a recognition of their being, in Cora Diamond's words, our fellow and having a human life to lead that is intimately entwined with others. Cooper's performance demands we stand in for him, to see ourselves as him, not because we are inspired by him, but because we, like him, construct ourselves out of the life of others. So sorry for going over time.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Paulson. I mean, we were sort of thinking about how we might adjust the schedule to allow for discussion, because I think some discussion would be really rich right here, and we do have some really great questions. So I'm going to ask you this from the Google Doc. Now this says, you speak so beautifully beyond words about the processes of the artists you discuss, Cooper and even your own son. Can you talk a bit about your own process of making connections between personal life, your basis as a medievalist scholar, and very contemporary culture? How practically do these things come together for you? Also, your writing is so beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that question. I'll try to keep it short. I didn't realize how long I was taking. But one of the things I will say is that I'm a medievalist by training, and I've become very interested in, as I said, kind of at the beginning of the talk, intelligence as a historically constructed category. And so looking at figures such as the fool, which to my mind is really differently understood during the Middle Ages. And to just give one example, in the poem Piers Plowman, Langland, the poet, is mostly interested in fools as a what they called artificial fools, which were like minstrels. And but when natural fools appear, they're grouped in with widows, with maidens, with infants, with madmen. All of those categories are people who, like the fool, lacks inwit. Langland said they all lack inwit, just like these fools who lack inwit, which is the only thing that distinguishes these fools from the other fools, which is so interesting to me. And so this is a piece of it, thinking about what do we mean by intelligence, and a more capacious understanding for how we think about personhood. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm interested in thinking about that, how we represent ourselves as something that changes in literature and over time, and as something that can be a more flexible and accessible category than maybe we're used to thinking about it, especially in literature departments, how we think about interiority.
Thank you so much for that answer and for that question. Very interesting perspective. Okay, now there is another question in the Google Doc I will pull from. It says, thinking back on the earlier panel today, How would you describe the difference between the healing power of representation versus the idea of fixing?
That is such an interesting question for disability studies, and something that, because I was actually just reading the other night about how disability studies and trauma studies, there's this kind of, they don't speak to each other because disability studies is so understandably and rightfully invested in thinking of, disability as not something that is a deficit, that is a full human, and yet it makes it very difficult to talk about pain, right? And I don't know if I have a final answer. I think it, speaking personally, Zachary's Down syndrome is part of who he is. Imagining a cure for that is kind of silly to me at this point. But on the other hand, if he gets, we do look for ways to increase his capacity and his ability to access things and to think in more complex ways and these sorts of things. So I think it's a really difficult question ultimately, and it's something that I struggle with.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing that very personal part of your life with us. It's an honor, really. And I see a hand from Dr. Shirky. Go ahead.
Hi, Julie, great talk. So hearing you mention the natural fool and being associated with women, et cetera, in the Middle Ages, well, I'm teaching Age of the Romantics this semester. And of course, that reminds me of the way the Romantics similarly valued lunatics and women and children as having natural wisdom. And I was wondering if you're also thinking about these figures in other literary eras. I'm reminded especially of Wordsworth's The Idiot Boy, or Dickinson's, to slip up to the Victorian area, Dickinson's Barnaby Rudge, which when I was an undergraduate, that was taught to me as a romantic novel, as epitomizing romanticism because of its celebration of Barnaby Rudge's natural wisdom, and the teacher connected it with Idiot Boy, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering if you're working any of those literary representations into your argument.
I haven't decided yet. There's been a lot of work on Wordsworth. Billy Budd also, comes up a lot. As Faulkner's Sound and the Fury, like there's lots of these figures, and they're interesting as sites of, they get taken up as sites of kind of the opposite of articulateness, right? And they get often romanticized, and they carry these symbols, and so there's a lot of work on that is really, really interesting and great. But I also kind of, a part of me wants to say, well, to really turn to people with intellectual disabilities and say, well, it's time to move away from looking just at representations. How do these people represent themselves? And you can't, of course, dissociate the two things from one another. They're always going to be mutually informing to one another. So I would never, put them aside. But in terms of kind of like where the heart is of this project, it's with self-representation.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Shirky, for that question. Any final question? I see a hand from Rebecca. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Hi, Dr. Paulson. Thank you so much for your talk. I enjoyed that so much. My question for you is, because I have a friend in the program who's actually planning on incorporating life writing into their thesis work. And so I'm really interested in incorporating life writing in an academic context. So have you ever written or published anything before in which you incorporated your life writing and personal experiences. And also in this particular project, have you run into any difficulties or struggles with doing that?
I haven't. This is the first. So this is a total departure from, I mean, I'm used to talking about the Middle Ages, which is a very safe, place in a lot of ways, because it's so long ago. So it's new. It's definitely vulnerable in a different way, like hearing all of these papers earlier about literature as we know it. I'm like, oh, I'm going to walk in and start talking about my kid, so I just kind of started doing it because it felt right. It felt honest. It felt like this is where this starts. And I needed to acknowledge that. So yeah, it's new. I haven't done it before.
Did it very beautifully, very skillfully. All right, and I see we have a hand from Summer. Go ahead, Dr. Starr. You're muted.
So good to see everyone, and Julie, thank you so much for sharing this in this venue. I think one of the things that I wanted to ask, and in part because I know a little bit about the work that you're doing within the university, is around this issue of self-representation, right, versus their representation of the disabled person, right, which you can track across different cultures. Like I was thinking of Smerdyakov and Dostoevsky, and where is that in the scholarly setting in the humanities for you, and enabling or opening space for academics with disabilities to self-represent and to potentially alter or expand the way in which academic fields operate?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So for those of you who don't know, I've been really active in inclusive education, both at our own university. I helped start an inclusive pilot project for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I'm working now to help pass a bill in the state legislature, AB 2920, which would give state funding to programs like the one at state throughout California. And I also am really, and a piece of this project is interested in composition studies in particular, and the role that composition, especially a lot of the stuff that we're doing here in our own composition program around, ungrading and various different ways of thinking about the voice and students' voices, and what it means to find your voice versus finding someone else's voice, I think really have a great role to play in how we think about the university and what are our universities for? Whom do they serve? What are their ultimate ends? Because there's this, on the one hand, ivory tower picture of excellence, and there's also a sometimes kind of clashing piece about good citizenship and making that education broad to everyone. I think, to my mind, it's critical that we acknowledge people with intellectual and other disabilities as part of our society, that we need to listen to and that have important things to say to us. So that I think that the humanities has an enormously important role to play with that, as not thinking about these, disability has for a long time in our culture been thought through as a medical category. And so to think about it as a human category, we're really well situated to, I think, expand how we understand our discipline and draw on its strengths here.
All right, thank you so much. Can we give Dr. Paulson another round of applause, Zoom or otherwise?
Well, thank you all.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us.